We're going to finish talking about the significance, or at least some of the central significance, some of the centrally significant things about Jesus in Christianity. So we talked just now in the last video about Jesus' atonement for our sins, according to Christians. That's the idea that by dying, by being killed, Jesus somehow, and we talked about different theories of how that happens, saves us from our sins. The fundamental problem of humanity is sin, according to Christianity and according to Judaism. And the solution is somehow found in Jesus. And not only that, but in his death. Somehow Jesus' death saves us from our sin. We talked about theories of that. We're going to talk about two of the other aspects of Jesus' significance for Christians. We talked about these three. We talked about the second one first. We're talking about the third and then the first. That is the resurrection and then his moral and spiritual teachings. So this is, I believe, a painting in the background by Caravaggio. And this depicts an event in which Thomas is putting his fingers into the side of Jesus. So when Jesus was crucified, he was stabbed with a spear by a Roman soldier after he had died. And so they would do that to make sure that the person was dead before they pulled him down from the cross. So he had wounds in each hand or wrist, probably, and then in each foot, and then in his side where he'd been stabbed with the spear. And Thomas, in some of the gospel narratives, was not there. I believe it's in the Gospel of John. Thomas was not there when Jesus showed up after he was resurrected. And he says, I'm not going to believe it until I can put my hand in his side and put my hand in the wounds in his hands. And so Jesus shows up again and tells Thomas, here, put your hand in my side. Here, put your hand on the wounds in my hands. That's why Thomas is called the Doubting Thomas. And you hear people talk about a doubter as calling them a Doubting Thomas. Okay, but this was post-resurrection. Jesus had been killed, had been raised from the dead. And again, as I emphasized before, it is not the claim of Christianity that he was merely unconscious when he was taken down from the cross and then woke up, but he never really died. And it's not the claim of Christianity that he merely momentarily died in the way that many humans will die and be brought back by a sort of medical means. The claim is that he fully died. He really did die. And in fact, according to early Christian creeds, he actually descended to hell during that time. Died Friday of Passover. And then on Sunday, according to the gospel narratives, some female followers of his were going to his tomb to put some spices and stuff on his body, basically prepare the body or take care of the body after it had been laying in a tomb on Friday. And they noticed that he wasn't there. And the accounts differ a little bit, not in ways that are incompatible with each other, but in ways that emphasize different things. That is the accounts in the 4 different gospels. But at any rate, the women were the first to see him. And then eventually he appeared, he came and saw the other apostles, the other disciples, and then saw more people after that. It's unclear. I'm not sure it's totally clear how long he was around before he ascended back into heaven. That's called the ascension, obviously. But he gets taken back up into heaven after that time. It's not hours. It's not even days. He's there. He's around for a little while before he's taken back up. And you can read about him being taken back up in the book of Acts in the Bible, which comes after the 4 Gospels. And it's the book that's about the Acts of the Apostles, right? It starts with Jesus being taken back up into heaven, and it ends with Paul, who we'll talk a little bit more about later, being taken to Rome to be tried. He's in custody, in Roman custody. Okay, so what is the significance of the resurrection? We said it's a miracle. It's a violation of the laws of nature in some sense. Jesus is being miraculously raised from the dead. He's not merely unconscious. What is the significance of this for Christianity? Well, as a point of fact, the resurrection is not as important as the atonement for most Protestants and even for Catholics. Interestingly, the Eastern Orthodox Church, again, these distinctions might not make any sense to you. We're going to talk about that a little bit in the future. But the Eastern Orthodox Church is a major Christian institution that's been around, well, depending on your view, it's been around for at least thousands of years. Thousands being more than 1,000. It split from the Catholic Church, I think, in 1054, might be 1052. Anyway, been around for a long time. It's a very large church, but anyway, they uniquely sort of emphasize the resurrection of Jesus, maybe even over the importance of his death. But for most Christians, what we can all agree on is that his death shows us that the atonement worked. That's one thing that it does, according to Christians. So whatever he did, so take maybe most centrally the Christus Victor view of the atonement. His death shows us that he actually did defeat sin and evil. His resurrection shows us that. The reason being, go back to the Genesis narrative, death is seen to be a result of sin and evil. When Adam and Eve were created, they were not going to naturally die. In fact, when they sin and God sends them out of the garden, he says, now you're going to die. I mean, not right now, obviously, they lived full lives, but they wouldn't have died otherwise, is the implication. So death is a result of sin and evil in the world. It is not part of the original plan of God or the original state of humanity. So what it shows when Jesus is raised from the dead, that is, death does not have dominion over him. Death does not, he is not prone to death, even as a human. We said Jesus is fully God, but he's also fully human. And he was raised as a human. When he was raised from the dead, he wasn't raised in purely spiritual God form. He was raised bodily from the dead. That's part of the point of the event depicted in this painting right here, is that he actually still had a body. Thomas was putting his fingers in the actual wounds, right? He had a real body. He was raised as a human. What does that show? It shows us that death does not apply to Jesus anymore. And therefore, somehow he has defeated sin, because sin is the origin of death. If he hadn't defeated sin, he would not be able to defeat death, because death is a result of sin. So somehow it shows us the atonement worked. Whatever the explanation of the atonement is, the atonement somehow worked. Just like we said, look, you can see a chemical reaction, you can ask for the explanation of it. You can also see the chemical reaction and know that it happened and that it worked without knowing the full explanation, because you're seeing it, right? Similarly, you can see gravity working even if you don't fully understand what makes it work. And so similarly, for Christians, what the resurrection does is it shows us, or it shows people in general, if Christianity is true, it shows people that the atonement worked, regardless of what the explanation is for why it worked. Somehow, Jesus solved the problem of sin. So that's one thing the resurrection is really significant for, right? It reveals that the atonement worked. Jesus is also called throughout the rest of the New Testament the first fruits of the resurrection. So he's resurrected and he's called the first fruits. What does that mean? The first fruits is a kind of agricultural metaphor. When the very first fruit pops up, that's the first fruits. But what that first fruit does is it shows you that more is coming. That's why it's called the first one. There's others that's implied. And so what Jesus' resurrection also does is it points humans to a future like Jesus's. Dead people have not been resurrected. Of course, in one of the gospel narratives, when Jesus dies, there are some dead people that come out of their graves. That's kind of a weird event, but that's in the Gospels. But by and large, people are not getting resurrected right now, according to Christians. People die, they go in the ground, they decompose, right? And the ones who've been dead for a long time, especially the ones before we started doing the stuff with all the chemicals, have like their bodies just aren't even there anymore. But what Jesus' resurrection does, besides showing us that the atonement worked, is that we are going to be like him. We are going to follow him in his fate of being resurrected. So part of the Christian message is that is a hope, a true hope in resurrection, that humans will be bodily resurrected. This part, maybe you might be a Christian and this might sound weird to you, but this is an aspect of true historical Christianity that has been downplayed in recent years. And a lot of Christians end up thinking that the Christian view is that they're just going to go to heaven as a disembodied soul, and that's going to be their perpetual fate. But the Christian view, in the Orthodox historical Christian view, is that maybe that will happen in the meantime. The Bible is not entirely clear on what's going to happen in the meantime, but our ultimate fate as humans is that we will be physically resurrected in real human bodies. And so what Jesus' death is, it shows us what Jesus' resurrection, I'm making that mistake a lot here, does, among other things, is it shows us that is what we can hope for. What happened to him as a human is going to happen to us as humans. Okay. Now, if you're skeptical of that, again, just look back to Genesis. The ideal state was in the Garden of Eden. That's what God wanted, and that's what he's trying to get us back to. That's why if you look at Genesis and you look at the book of Revelation in the New Testament, Revelation is pointing towards a future state that looks, and the author of Revelation, John, is making direct references to things that happened in Genesis. He's saying, oh yeah, there's going to be a tree in this final state, right? The tree of life. That's what's going on. There's going to be a river, just like there was flowing through Eden, right? He's making direct, intentional references back to Eden, because the whole narrative of the Bible is God created humans to be in a certain state. They fell from that state. And then the whole narrative of the Bible is him trying, and ultimately through Jesus, according to Christians, bringing humans back to be in that state. It won't be exactly the same, but that's his intended state. He didn't start us off in Eden saying like, all right, now y'all get out of here and go do something with your lives, right? He said, no, this is how I want you to live. In submission to me, spreading order out of Eden, just like I did. Be my image bearers in the world. So, assuming all of that, what does Eden look like? Well, a lot of things, but one of the aspects of Eden is that Adam and Eve had physical human bodies. And so if God is really trying to get us back to an ideal state, and that ideal state is revealed to us in the Genesis narrative in Eden before the fall, we should expect this sort of thing. We should expect the ideal state to be one. The end state God's trying to bring us back to is one in which we have human bodies. Okay, so that is what Jesus' resurrection does. That's the sort of, in a nutshell, the significance of the resurrection. It shows that the atonement worked, that sin and evil has been defeated, and thus death has been defeated. And it shows us the object of our hope as humans, according to Christians, is that we will be bodily resurrected and live eternally in that state. Now, let me say one more thing before I move on from this. We will, if Jesus truly is the first fruits, as the New Testament refers to him, and Jesus does show us what we can hope for ultimately after we die and then are resurrected, then we can learn a lot about that hope by looking at the nature of Jesus' existence after the resurrection and before the ascension. And one thing we just noted was that he does have a physical body, a human body, a real human body, a real physical body. He's not the spirit floating around. He actually still has the wounds. So one thing is that we'll have that physical body, according to Christians. The other thing is it will be a body that is clearly continuous with our current earthly body, right? He's not like this new person, right? He actually still has the wounds, weirdly. He's not even, his body is not even like fully perfect, right? He actually still has the wounds that he suffered before he died. Is that something we should expect, according to Christians, in the resurrection state? Am I still going to have the scars I have tons of scars on my hands from I can't even remember what most of them are from. I have a scar on the back of my head from 4th grade where somebody pulled out my chair from under me and I fell back onto a rusty screw in a desk and split my head open. lots of scars, bones broken that have come back together. If you were to look at that bone, there'd be like, whatever you'd see in a bone after it's healed up, ankle sprains, things like that. In a resurrected state, will my body have all of the signs of those things having happened to me in the past? Well, if we can judge from Jesus, maybe he still had the wounds. A second thing, and then we'll move on, is that Jesus, even while he does have a human body, a physical body, and even though it is clearly continuous, they recognize Jesus. He's clearly the same guy. So it's clearly the same kind of body with a lot of the same features. It also has some new features. So in the Gospels, after the resurrection, you get the story of Jesus, of the apostles. After Jesus has been killed, they're scared to death. Before they know that he's been resurrected, they're scared to death because they were part of this movement that just got branded as a revolutionary movement, and their leader was just executed for it. So what are you going to do if you're one of these apostles during this? You're going to go freaking hide and lock yourself up somewhere, which is exactly what they did. They hid. They locked themselves in a room because they were afraid that they were going to be hunted down. Not only were they followers, but they were 12 of the 12 closest followers, the one he took in his confidence. If you're trying to crush a rebellion, you're not just going to go knock out that head guy. You're going to go knock out those other guys too. So they're scared. They've got the door locked. And suddenly, in the gospel narratives, Jesus is there in the room. He's in the room. Now, I don't know about your body, your physical human body, but mine can't walk through walls. And Jesus's did. Or if it didn't walk through a wall, it showed up kind of discontinuously from one spot to another. It's just like bloop, transported itself into that room. So again, second is that while our bodies, our resurrected bodies will be the same body with even maybe some of the same flaws and the same person, they will maybe have new properties. Jesus' body apparently had new properties. That's not the kind of stuff he was doing before he died. He wasn't walking through walls. Although he was transfigured at one point before his death. So you never know. But anyway, but if you can judge, if Jesus is the true first fruit, we can judge, we can assume, or we can hope for, as if you're on the Christian view, humans can hope for a resurrection of a physical body that is the same body. You're the same person as you were before you died, but actually has some new properties, right? And is maybe perfected in some ways. Okay, so that's the significance of the resurrection in a nutshell. Finally, in this video, the third aspect, we're going to talk about Jesus's moral and spiritual teaching. And there's so much more to it here. This is where you can really delve in, because when you actually look at the gospel narratives, you see that the death and resurrection of Jesus take up a small minority of that. And if you just judge from what, normal Protestant Christians focus on, you'd think the whole gospel narratives are about the death of Jesus. Maybe a tiny bit about the resurrection. But the vast majority of the text of the Gospels is about Jesus' teaching and what he did in the world besides dying and being resurrected. So there's a lot to be said here. I think this is maybe the one of these three aspects of Jesus' significance that I'm going to touch on, that I'm going to exhaust the least, just because there's so much to be said. And there's so much subtlety and disagreement. But generally we can say these things at sort of a 30,000 foot height. Jesus says that he came to fulfill, not to abolish, the law of Judaism. That's really important, I think. Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't just this guy who came in from somewhere else. He was a Jew who was trained in Judaism. He knew the Torah, for example, backwards and forwards. So what he does is he says that he's summarizing the law, the Jewish law, in these two commandments. Someone comes to him and says, what is the greatest commandment? This is actually a trick, right? They're trying to ensnare him because they're pissed at him. And at this point, they want to kill him and they want an excuse. So they're trying to trick him into saying something stupid. So they ask him what the greatest commandment is. And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Or I might be getting that wrong. Heart, mind, and strength. That's the greatest one. And the next one is love your neighbor as yourself. And he orders them in that way. He says, love God first, love your neighbor second. And then he says all of the law and the prophets can be summarized in these two things. Well, that's an interesting claim because there's a lot of laws we saw when we're talking about Judaism. There's 613 that are explicit in the Hebrew Bible. And then there's the prophets. He says, I can summarize all of that for you in 2 commandments. All 613 of those, love God and love other people. That's what he says. And a lot of his teaching can be seen as working out the details of this, especially the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount shows a profound concern and for the sort of oppressed in society. He tells people that they should forgive endlessly, right? He says, people ask, how many times should you forgive someone who wrongs you? Is it, once or twice or 3 or 7 times? And he says, no, not 7, 7 times 7. Basically, the implication here is it's a Jewish turn of phrase to say you should just keep forgiving forever. It's a crazy thing. Now, a lot of people will be quick to point out, and this is where you get into a little bit of the nuance, Jesus is not recommending people to be doormats, right? If you've got an abusive family member, he's not saying, well, just keep letting them abuse you. Forgiveness is distinct from enabling, right? You can forgive someone without enabling. And the nature of forgiveness is kind of hard to pin down, but that's one thing we know about it, is that you can forgive without enabling. He tells people that they should reconcile out of court, right? If they have a problem with someone who's done something, they should, reconcile with them on the walk to court before they get there. He tells people, he condemns divorce, except in cases of infidelity. Again, all of these things could be taken as working out of especially that second commandment, loving your neighbor as yourself. Especially in these days too, when you're talking to men and telling them that they shouldn't divorce their wives except in cases of infidelity, you might be wondering, well, wait a second, how is that an expression of love? I mean, I'm not saying that it's a bad command, but how's an expression of love for your neighbor to not divorce? Well, especially in that day, I think Christians are going to argue that this is an expression of love in general, but it's even more visible in how the society, Jesus' society, worked in that day. So at that time, if you were a dude, if you were a man divorcing your wife, you could really leave her in the lurch, financially speaking, right? Is that you could divorce your wife and she'd just be kind of screwed. She'd be unable to provide for herself and unable to have a husband who provided for her. And, she could starve to death, right? Or at least lived a really horrible life. And so to command someone not to divorce, especially in that day, and Christians are going to say, even now, is an act of love for your neighbor. So that's why I say it could be working out of that, the details of that second commandment. And then to look at the first commandment, Jesus tells people to trust God to take care of you and don't worry about the future. So he says, look at the sparrows flying around, look at these flowers in the field. They are beautifully clothed and they're not worrying about it at all. So what he's telling people is to trust in the generosity of a God who created the world, right? He's not just saying, hey, look at those birds. Oh, okay, now think about yourself. He's saying, no, the birds are living in God's world, the same world that you're living in. They were created by the same God that created you. And he's pointing people to the generosity and the goodness of God. And that's kind of crazy, given that he was living in a world where he got killed. Right? So to say, don't worry about the future, is he just being naive? I don't think so. I think there's something much deeper to what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, he's not denying, obviously. He knows that he's going to be killed. You can see that when you read the Gospels. What he's saying is, despite the evil in the world, you still need to recognize that you live in a world created by a good and generous and loving God. And you need to trust that God. So that is the working out of that, or one of the many workings out of that first commandment, to love God. Now, there are some other cases that are not as clear cut, right? You might think you've heard all about Jesus' nonviolence. Gandhi and MLK both took a lot of inspiration from Jesus and his teachings on nonviolence. Jesus tells people, if somebody slaps you on the cheek, turn the other cheek to them. And if they ask you to walk a mile with them, walk a second mile. If they take your shirt, if they take your cloak, give them your shirt too. So in that day, you wore a cloak over a shirt, and then that was it. So on first pass, Jesus seems to be saying just like radical generosity here. And especially in turning the other cheek, when someone acts violently towards you, do not respond with violence, but almost like invite them to do further violence to you. And this can, as you probe it, this can even start to sound like nonviolence to the point of stupidity. Now, there have been some commentators who say, yeah, so that should tell us that we're not reading this correctly. And especially as we probe these three commandments, or these three pieces of advice that Jesus gives, turn the other cheek, walk a second mile, give your shirt when they ask for your cloak, you start to probe them and you see there's some weird things about these. Let's take the last one, for example. You're wearing a shirt, like a long shirt, probably, I don't know, down to your knees. And then on top of that, a cloak. And that's all you've got on, essentially, maybe like some little underwear garment. So wait, Jesus is saying when someone takes your cloak and then you're standing there in your shirt, your long shirt that's still covering all your body, you're at that point, you're fine. Maybe you're not as protected from the sun. If it's cold, maybe you're not quite as warm, but it's not embarrassing for you. But then you should basically take off the rest of your clothes and give it to them too. So you should be standing there naked. And they didn't even ask for your shirt. They probably don't want your shirt. They probably only want the cloak. So how is this an act of love for that other person, or radical generosity to give them this thing that they don't want, and that is going to be incredibly embarrassing for you? You're going to be standing there naked. What's the thing with walking a mile and walking a second mile? We're just going to focus in on all the puzzling aspects of these before I give you an interpretation, a sort of non-standard interpretation of Jesus's claims here. Well, in that day, a Roman soldier could legally compel someone to carry their crap for a mile, basically. That was part of Roman law. You could make somebody carry your stuff for a mile. But the law said only a mile. After that, you got to take your stuff back and find somebody else to force to carry your crap. So now, wait a second. Knowing that background, what is Jesus actually advising here? That you should do something that actually breaks the law? They've made you go a mile, they're still within the law, and then they're like, all right, you're free, and you say, no, I'm still going. And there's what's going to happen then? Let's imagine the social dynamic here. The Roman soldier has forced you to walk a mile with their crap, and they say, all right, you're free to go, give me the crap back. And you say, no, I'm going to walk some more. And what's going to happen then? What's the next step in that social interaction? What if you're the Roman soldier? What are you going to say? Well, you're probably going to say, please don't. I do not want you to do that. You're going to get me in trouble. If somebody sees you walking this 2 miles with me, they're going to assume that I made you do it. I'm going to get punished in whatever way the Roman would get punished for that. Please don't do it. I'm not asking you for that. I can find someone else to do that. There's people all along this road. You just give my stuff to somebody else. And you say, no, I'm going with you a second mile. And they're like, no, I'm not asking for that. You're going to get me in trouble. Turning the other cheek. Again, someone slaps you. They've given you the insult. Do they want to slap you again necessarily? Not always. So why are you inviting that? Why are you inviting them to do this thing that they've already accomplished? Okay, so puzzling aspects of all of these three little pieces of advice. There have been some who give an alternate interpretation. It's not Jesus inviting people to doormattery or to sort of doormat-oriented generosity. But really, there's a guy named Walter Wink who has argued for this. He is arguing for nonviolence, but he's arguing for clever nonviolence. So let's work our way back again. Giving someone your shirt when they ask for your cloak. Basically, someone asks for your cloak and you give it to them. You're not being violent. You're not responding with violence to violence. But in giving them your shirt, what's going to happen? You're going to be standing there naked. And what's going to happen then? Well, you're going to totally embarrass the person who has just asked you for your cloak. Like imagine you're at a party, someone asks you for your jacket, or they demand your jacket by force or whatever, and you say, okay, and then you just strip off all your clothes and hand it to them. And there's other people standing around like, what's going on here? Why is this guy making this guy strip down? So you can interpret, and the way Wink interprets Jesus is he's saying, by this sort of clever move, you have turned the tables without engaging in the same sort of coercion. They're trying to coerce you out of your stuff. And by this clever move of giving them more stuff than they asked for and thereby becoming essentially naked, you have embarrassed them, especially in that day and that time, into maybe even not taking any of your stuff. So someone is coercing you, someone is oppressing you. And this is the general model here to try to abstract away from the particular cloak shirt case. Someone's oppressing you. How can you respond? Well, you could fight back and then maybe get killed, especially if you're a Jew being oppressed by Romans who are much more powerful than you. You might fight back and get killed. At the very least, you're not going to win. You're not going to be able to keep your cloak. Or you could give away your cloak, or you could capitulate in exactly the way they're asking for, and then you've been coerced into doing something and giving up something, either your stuff or your life, or a lot of pain. And the person got exactly what they wanted. They walk away smug. But if you follow this route, you're not responding in violence, and you're not being a doormat. But without using violence, you've managed to get the person to not oppress you. Sort of clever nonviolence. Think about walking the second mile. I think I maybe talked about this one enough for you to see how the same thing is working there. You're walking that second mile. You're actually not by any sort of violence or coercion on your part. You're actually putting pressure on that Roman soldier to not be oppressing people in the way that he is. If everybody said, I'm going to just go with you a second mile, then that Roman soldier is going to stop asking people to carry his crap because he doesn't want to get in trouble. So you got him to stop engaging in the oppressive behavior without engaging in similarly coercive or oppressive behavior. It's clever nonviolence, achieving the end of stopping violence, but without using violence yourself. Similarly, turning the other cheek, this is maybe the most interesting one. In Jesus's day, what's assumed is that someone would slap you with their right hand. Now, this is Wink's argument. Again, I'm just presenting Wink's argument. Their left hand was considered dirty. This is actually still true in many cultures in the world. The left hand is considered dirty or unclean. So everyone listening to Jesus when he says, if someone slaps you with the right hand, turn them the other cheek, would assume that slap happens with the right hand. And again, according to Wink, it would have been incurred a bigger legal penalty to backhand someone, right? That would have incurred a punishment that was illegal, than to do it with the front side. This is more violent than this. And so everyone would know they're slapping you with the front side of their right hand. And what that means is they're going to slap you on your left cheek, their right. So that as they're looking at you, they're slapping you on the right cheek. But from your perspective, it's your left, right here. So what happens when you turn the other cheek for them to slap? Well, they've got two options, right? If you say, okay, now slap me right here, what can they do? Think about it. Pause if you want to and think about it. Think about the mechanics of this. Here's what they can do. They can backhand you with the right hand, right? They can no longer slap you with the front of this hand unless they do some weird thing over here, right? But there's two natural options here. It's to backhand across the left cheek or your right cheek with the right hand, or to slap you with the left hand, with the front side of the left hand, which again is unclean. And they can't in that society do either of those things. So what's going to play out if in Jesus's day, someone slaps you and you say, okay, now get me right here? They, unless they want to be punished, are going to have to stand there awkwardly embarrassed and be like, okay, no, I can't. So you're putting a ton of social pressure on them. You're not striking back. That's the thing. The initial sort of natural inclination will be to hit them back And again, that could result in you dying, especially if this person is more powerful than you. And at the very least, it's responding to a bad thing with another bad thing. So, but the alternative, it seems like before Jesus says this, you might think, well, but what's my alternative? Just to be a doormat and let them hit me? So, but what Jesus is doing is he's saying no, according on Wink's interpretation, he's saying, no. There's a middle way. You don't want to respond to violence with violence. That's why violence is bad. Why would we multiply violence? But you don't want to be a doormat and just let people oppress you. So how can you get the benefit of violence, that is stopping the oppression, without the downside of it, that is the violence? And he says, so we need a non-violent way of stopping oppression, and Jesus is giving us that. He's saying by cleverness and using, by hook or by crook, social pressure, embarrassment, the threat of working someone into a corner where they're going to be punished if they continue doing what they do, get someone to stop the sort of violence or coercion that they're engaged in. So that's sort of the less clear-cut, the less obvious, but a second interpretation of Jesus's claims here. He's not advising you to be a doormat. He's actually advising you to do something totally different than violence or doormattery. Clever nonviolence is what Jesus is advising. Now, that's one interpretation. I don't want to throw that on you. I'm just giving you a different way of interpreting these very famous teachings of nonviolence that Jesus gives. And that way is that Jesus is not advising people to be doormats and to just to be punished as much as someone wants to punish them, to be oppressed as much as someone wants to oppress them, but to use clever means that are still nonviolent of getting someone to stop their oppression. And you could argue that MLK Jr. did just this. MLK Jr. was not just a doormat. He actually succeeded in his goal by social efforts, by, clever ways of embarrassing people, by all kinds of different means, but they were all nonviolent, right? He didn't just lay there and say, you know what, we just got to let them do what they're going to do, and we just got to take it. That's not what he did. And so if Wink is right, MLK is actually following the truer advice that Jesus is giving. Okay, and that's where I'll leave you for now.